I was born in a little tiny hospital in France. In the Northeast, my father was working for NATO and forces establishing microwave repeater stations across Europe. And my parents moved to France with my two brothers, and they elected to live in a little village rather than on the military base so that my brothers could go to a French school and they could experience village life. And I think it's okay to say this, both my parents would have agreed, I was a mistake. I was, I was definitely an unplanned arrival. Well, the family was due to leave, and so I was, I don't know, 3 or 4 months old when we made the journey back to Ottawa. Um, Partly, we left Ottawa when I was 6 and emigrated to New Zealand. So that's where I did most of my schooling. And then we came back for me to go to university in Canada. My parents were, well, and I were looking for a place to settle in Canada, and it's a long story which you don't want to hear all of, I'm quite sure, but we had spent 3 years getting back to Canada. So we had been living in a motorhome together for 3 years, and I was very impatient to find somewhere, anywhere, it didn't really matter to me, so that we could get out of this motorhome together. And my parents were, I guess, a bit more choosy about where we stopped. And we got to Victoria and we'd sort of run out of Canada, so we stayed there. And I went to UVic to do my undergraduate degree. I did an honors undergraduate degree, and my supervisor was very keen that I should continue in academia. I was not so keen, but in an effort to, I guess, persuade me, he organized a friend of his colleague to take me as a master's student at the University of Waterloo. So I arrived in January. And yes, I hadn't experienced snow since I was a 6-year-old, and it was all a bit of a shock to me. And Waterloo was so much bigger in terms of the campus, and really at the time, I wouldn't say dominated by, but the presence of the engineering and mathematics and computer science programs was really strong. But I had a very happy year in Waterloo, but it made me realize that I was kind of impatient to get out and get on with life, and that doing a doctorate just wasn't for me. And I had a friend who we played squash with together, and he dared me to write the Foreign Service exam. He'd tried it once before and hadn't been successful, and I probably said something silly like, "Oh, I could do that," just to annoy him. And then I wrote the exam and was called for an interview, and before I knew it, I was on my way I went to Toronto first to work in the regional office of Industry, Trade and Commerce. Well, it's a real privilege in many respects to get to represent your country, and to also have the experience of living and working in other countries and being able to immerse yourself to the extent that's not really possible as a tourist or a visitor. So to be able to live somewhere for 2 or 3 or 4 years, maybe learn the language, it's quite a different experience, and it's a very rich experience. So I was very much a generalist in that I didn't specialize in a region. So I had 2 assignments in Africa, one in Australia, one in India, and then finally in Hungary as ambassador. So it was a marvelous career, a marvelous experience for which I'm extremely grateful. At the time, the government has swung between centrally managed and decentralized management of the ADM community. And while I was at Foreign Affairs, as it was then, the switch went back to a centrally managed pool. And I felt very strongly, because all the time I'd been at Foreign Affairs, which up to that point was 21 years, I had felt very much a part of the Foreign Service, but not so much part of the public service. And I realized that my network, which was excellent within the international network or the international pool of employees in the public service. But beyond that, it really was non-existent, partly by virtue of being abroad, being outside Canada, but also not having the same opportunities for interaction. So I was quite keen on the idea of a centralized pool where I could actually potentially go and work in other departments and then return to Foreign Affairs after gaining some useful knowledge about what I call domestic departments. No department is really domestic anymore, but those who aren't Foreign Affairs or CEDA at the time or immigration. And so I went through the selection process, which was quite formidable set of interviews, and went into the pool. And I was pretty confident that, I guess I was realistic in terms of my expectations about getting a call. But in fact, I did get a call within about a week from Wayne Waters, who was then the Deputy Minister at Fisheries and Oceans, asking if I would like to come and be interviewed for the ADM policy position. And of course, the relationship between Foreign Affairs and DFO at the time was, how can I put it, a little tense because of the problems we were having with overfishing by European fleets off the East Coast. And so off I went for the interview, and I was successful and decided to go. The going was a lot easier than the going back, and which I regret very much, but I don't regret the experience that I was able to gain in other departments. Originally, I was the Assistant Secretary of Government Operations and International Security and Defense. So I had 2, in effect, sectors, but it took a little while to organize the division of the 2. So I had these 2 very disparate sectors which were what the TBS called program sectors. And it was a revelation to me, I must say, Treasury Board Secretariat. It was such a great opportunity to learn how government works and how it funds itself about which I was woefully ignorant, I think. Well, I can still remember the day, it was a Wednesday, when Wayne called me up to his office and said he would like me to do this. And so I had to find somebody to replace me, and Bill Austin kindly stepped up to replace me. And then I had to get a copy of the Conservative platform and actually read what this first priority entailed. And in fairness, Mylène Bouzigon, who at the time was our legal advisor, she had been suggesting for several weeks that we actually give some thought to how we might achieve this. And so Mylène was my first stop. Never having written an MC in my life, never having worked on a piece of legislation in my life. Maybe it was an advantage in that I just didn't know what was the norm and what I was taking on, because I'm not sure in hindsight I would have volunteered for the job. So we had very limited time, and it was not only taken up with beginning to develop a process, but it was also about finding space and recruiting a team and all those practical things. So yes, it was a very exciting time. So my marching orders were to get a piece of legislation through the House as quickly as possible. And it was legislation that was designed, I think, to show the government's resolve to respond to the Gomery Commission, but also some real, some perceived weaknesses in management practices in the public service, and to increase transparency. So there were changes to the Access to Information Act, for example. So it was fairly wide-ranging in the breadth of issues that it covered. And we very much approached it in sections. And I realized very quickly that the only way we could do this quickly was by not creating a team to replicate the work of policy specialists in a whole range of departments and agencies, but to harness their knowledge and energy with a small team that would essentially be a process driver and an organizer and a convener. I think the Accountability Act was at the time, and perhaps still is, misunderstood. It was not a punishment for public servants. And it was, so for example, the Lobbyist Registration Act, which came in as a result, that had nothing to do with the accountability of public servants. And I think there were actually many elements of the Federal Accountability Act which were useful and timely. 20 years hence, they should probably be looked at again. But I think at the time, they were fit for purpose. I think in the process of it going through the House and then the Senate, there was a certain, which is inevitable, it is all part of the democratic process, there was a politicization. And I regretted, for example, at the end, when it was billed in communications material as the toughest anti-corruption legislation Canada had ever seen. That wasn't what the Accountability Act was about. least not the one I drafted. And it was much more important than that. In a sense, it was much more fundamental than that. So I regret some of the communications and the lack of understanding about what was in the act, and the fact that I don't think anybody saw it as punitive. That wasn't the purpose. Well, it's an interesting notion. I think there were a lot of things contributing to fear or a reluctance to be accountable. For the first time, really, as a result of the rise of social media and the fundamental changes in communications, public servants became much more identifiable. There was also, I would say, I don't want to use the term weakening because that implies a judgment on my part, but there was a change in the relationship between ministers and senior public servants, and the tradition of sort of ministerial accountability that was beginning to be eroded, I would say. The media was different in its approach to public servants, and the public service in general. So I think there were a lot of things contributing at about the same time. So my last assignment in the public service before I retired was a review of the HR legislation, so the Public Service Employment Act and the Public Service Labor Relations Act. It was, I can't say I was thrilled that that was my job. It was not something I would have chosen for myself, but consistent with my experience throughout my career, I should suspend judgment because it turned out to be one of the most interesting assignments I had ever had. So I spent 2 years doing a legislative review of the legislation. And I would say that my conclusions were not universally popular. And with respect to the Public Service Commission, which lies at the heart of our nonpartisan public service, because the Public Service Commission was created to remove the appointment authority from politicians and centralize it in an apolitical structure which reports to Parliament and not to a minister. I was very critical in my review of the Public Service Commission, not the institution itself, or necessarily any of the individuals leading it, but of the way in which it was executing its mandate and the effect it was having. You spoke of a chill, so the effect it was having on managers and employees in the public service. And when the clerk asked me if I would like to work at the Public Service Commission so I could address the shortcomings I'd identified, I thought it was a bit churlish to say, well, actually, no, I'm not that interested. But what I didn't want to do, I was really not 100% healthy. And so the president's job was not really feasible for me. And so I said, but I'd be happy to serve as one of the part-time commissioners. So the commission sits as a commission, and you don't want 3 people running there are 3 commissioners, I should say, and you don't really want 3 people running an organization. So one of the commissioners is full-time now. It it began as a 3-person commission doing everything together, but it's not really practical or tenable. So one of the commissioners is full-time and is the deputy head, if you effectively, so runs the organization. And the other 2 are part-time commissioners. And the Public Service Commission takes all of its decisions as a commission, for which the commission is finally accountable, and the decisions are reviewable in federal court. So the commission appoints all public servants. We delegate that authority to deputy heads, and then we conduct, I shouldn't use the present tense anymore, but the commission then audits and investigates the use of that authority. Leadership to me means setting an example. I think, in sort of current parlance, walking the talk. You can say lots of things, and things that are important and things that are good, but unless you are actually living and demonstrating those same things, you're not, in my opinion, demonstrating leadership. It means doing difficult things. It means taking difficult decisions at times. Leadership is not easy, and it's not always fun, but it is hugely rewarding to have the opportunity to lead and find that people are interested in or willing to follow you. So yes, I did. I would say, and what I have tried in those instances is to figure out what it is that's bad and make a promise to myself not to do the same thing. So to the extent I could, I tried to turn those often unpleasant working relationships into something useful for me for the future. I suspect it has changed over the years. Canada has changed, the private sector has changed, so I'd be worried actually if the public service also hadn't changed. A good public servant is someone who has an awareness of the public interest. It's not necessarily a career for passionate advocates, for whom there is a great place in society. I'm just not sure it's in the public service. We need people who, are aware of the public interest and their ability to serve it and to do what is right for the public at large. It also, I think, a good public servant is interested in facts and in information and in the experience of others, so some sort of curiosity about their field of endeavor. And it's also about making the relationship between the nonpartisan public service and the political world work. The politicians who are elected by Canadians have been elected to govern, to make decisions, and they play a very different role from public servants, and the two, without each other, the Westminster system doesn't work. It was a lot bigger, for starters, and big organizations present their own set of challenges in terms of management and leadership. I would say that public servants perhaps had less confidence in both their place in society. There was a certain reverence for public servants. I think that has gone. There is an appreciation on the part of many Canadians for the public service, but there isn't the same sort of reverence that's given without necessarily an experience to back it up. So, and I regret that very much, and I particularly regret it in the area of people management, where the review that I did showed me clearly that we had legislation that was enormously permissive, and yet we managers in the public service were not using that legislation as we could have and should have. Probably two or three things. The first is that it offers a remarkable experience, a remarkable life experience. And the variety of jobs which can be accessed within the public service is unparalleled. I don't think there's another organization in the country that offers that breadth of experience. The second thing is, and I know it's extremely difficult with the speed at which things move, but it is really important to make sure that recommendations and advice that we give has a solid foundation. It takes time, and time is sort of one thing that nobody has, but that's a challenge we have to confront. And the other thing I think that's really important is the fearless advice. So I prefer that to truth to power, because it implies there is only one truth and that nobody else has the power. And anyway, for all sorts of reasons, I prefer the fearless advice and the loyal implementation. And, you know, when I worked for Prime Minister Harper, we agreed on almost nothing, but he read everything I wrote. I always had a chance to make my case, and that is all I could ask for. And it's so important to understand the place of a public servant. I think you have a happier and more successful career if you understand how the pieces work together. And so, are there things that were done during my tenure that I would have preferred had not been done? Absolutely. But all I was employed to do was to provide advice and guidance. And in fact, Mr. Harper very kindly said at one point that perhaps that was my greatest asset, was the fact that I would say things that nobody else around him would say. And so that fearless advice is really, really important.